Hello guys, welcome back to another book recommendation. I just finished reading Shadow Divers by Robert Kurson. And it states here the true adventure of two men who risked everything to solve one of the last mysteries of World War II, and that's exactly what it is. On the cover is a diver going down the anchor line into the deep ocean. And the story is mainly following two divers that spent 6 years of their lives trying to figure out what the identity of that U-boat is, which one it was, and why it was there off the coast of New Jersey. Because there was no record of any U-boat being even near there or sunk there. So it's really a story of deep rig diving, which is extremely dangerous sport. And it also has elements of history in it, because they kind of have to rewrite some of the history about the U-boats because it was inaccurate. It also has a biographical element to it about John Chatterton and Kohler, who are the main two divers. Chatterton was a medic in Vietnam, and how he came to be a commercial diver and later on diving on this U-boat and how they found it. But the whole adventure takes a heavy toll, as you will see when you read the book. It becomes an obsession for these divers to figure out the identity of the actual U-boat. If this already sounds like something you'd like to read, just take my word for it. It's a great book. Pick it up, start reading it. I think it's best read if you don't know anything about it at all, because then everything will be a surprise. But if you want to know more about the book and the story, just keep watching the video, but know that there will be spoilers. It's hard for me to talk about the book without there being any spoilers. This all started in 91, when a fishing boat captain found something that might or might not be an interesting wreck. He noticed that there was a lot of fish and good fishing there, and there usually are a lot of marine life on old wrecks. So he didn't know what was there, but he could see on his sonar that something interesting might be there. So he gave those numbers to a dive captain that had a dive boat named the Seeker. And he immediately called up his good friend John Chatterton, and they got a dive crew together and they went out on the seas. And in the book this is called Mystery Numbers, which is the lingo for some GPS coordinates out in the sea where you might find something, but you might also not. And on the first dive he discovered that it's an old U-boat. Of course he couldn't tell if it was German or not, or what kind of U-boat it was. But that got the whole thing started, and everybody was very excited to figure out what was down there and why it was there in the first place. Deep rig diving is an extremely dangerous sport, and they estimate that maybe 100 people was doing that in the States in 91. Deep rig diving doesn't share quite as much with the normal scuba diving as you might think. In shallow tropical waters, mainly looking at fish on the coral reefs that are not very far down. Two of the most dangerous things about deep rig diving, stemming from the depth itself, down to maybe 200 feet or 250 even, is nitrogen narcosis, which can start to happen at 66 feet and further down. And that's an sort of intoxication by nitrogen that makes it feel like the diver is drunk and impairs a lot of his thinking and motor skills. The second most dangerous thing is a decompression that you have to do before you surface. If you dive down to, let's say, 200 feet, and you stay there for 25 minutes, then you have to do an hour of decompression stops on the way back to the surface. If you don't, you might get bent, also called decompression sickness, and little bubbles will start spreading out in your joints and your bloodstream, and it'll kill you, and it'll be horribly painful. So surfacing without proper decompression is almost a death warrant for a very painful death. And those are just the two main things. Other than that, if you dive on wrecks, there might be all kinds of stuff you can get tangled inside the wreck. Something might fall on you. You might get pinned. If it's a complex wreck, you might get lost. Also, when you're diving inside something that has been down there for ages, there's a lot of silt. And if you hit it with your fin or you move around stuff, then your visibility might go to even zero. So you can't see anything and you'll have to know by memory how to get back out. And diving in the North Atlantic is, of course, with low visibility usually anyway. And then there's a current. You need to descend on the anchor line and down to the wreck and do your decompression stops back up the anchor line. If you lose the anchor line, or if the current grabs you and drives you off the wreck, then you'll have to surf somewhere out in the ocean and you might never be found. And also it'll be very hard to do your decompression stops at the correct depths and staying in the right places. for an hour, trying to make it to the surface if you don't have the anchor line to hold on to. You can also have equipment failure, and you would have to deal with that without panicking, and all of these things will be highly difficult to deal with without panicking because you have nitrogen narcosis, and it feels like you've drunk 5 martinis on an empty stomach. You can also have a deep sea blackout. You basically just lose unconscious, and nobody really knows why. But if you lose your consciousness at those depths, you just die, you drown. And that actually happens to one of the divers on the second dive they do on the U-boat. He has a deep sea blackout and he drowns and dies. Another thing that's very different from normal scuba diving is that the body system, which everybody uses if you've ever gone scuba diving, and which makes a lot of sense on shallow waters and diving on reefs, is that your body will help you if you have trouble, if you all of a sudden run out of oxygen or something like that. He can lend you his regulator, or he can get you untangled if you for some reason get stuck on the reef or whatever happens. He might be helpful to you, but most deep wreck divers dive without a body because they don't want the body to kill them if the body panics. If he runs out of oxygen, he might go for yours. And obviously he knows he's dead if he doesn't get oxygen, so he might be in a wild panic and he might kill you too. He might grab onto you and pull both of you to the surface without decompression, and that'll kill you both as well. So many deep wreck divers dive alone, and there are actually situations in the book where something like this happens and a diver panics and it almost kills some of the other guys because they try to help. Another difference is that the deep wreck divers dive with 2 oxygen tanks, so they have enough oxygen to do the decompression stops when they go back up for an hour. So all of those are perils of deep wreck diving, a sport that can easily kill you and kills lots of people. And in fact, 3 divers die diving the U-boat trying to figure out what it is. And the first guy dies on the second dive, and those that still want to dive the wreck will continue diving on it. And then later on, a father and a son dies on the same wreck. And there's also pictures in the book of the artifacts that they recover, and also of the people involved. If you take a look at this, the first part there, this one is the first plate they recover, and it says 1942 and has a swastika on it, and that tells them it's a German U-boat. That's the first thing they recover. That's Steve Philman. He's the diver that dies on the second dive. And here are more pictures. These are the 2 tanks you need to do deep diving in order to have enough gas to get back up with the decompression stops. And this is Chris and Chrissy Rouse, father and son, and they're the other 2 people who died on the U-boat. And there's a separate book about that, in fact, called The Last Dive. And they were very accomplished divers, and they came over from cave diving. And they also usually dove on trimix, something that Chatterton, one of the main characters of the book, starts doing after, I think, the second year after they discover the U-boat. And trimix is a mix of helium into the normal mix that you would breathe air. And that makes sure that you don't get nitrogen narcosis. You can also stay down a little bit longer before you have to go up. But that fatal day, the Rouses did not have trimix. It was a pioneering thing back then. And in fact, John Chatterton mixed it in his garage. He would stand outside it and just have his hand in from outside the garage. So if it exploded, he would only lose his hand. And so you couldn't just go down to your local dive shop and get some trimix. But the Rouses usually had adopted diving with trimix to avoid the nitrogen narcosis. But on that fatal day, they didn't bring trimix, so they had to dive on normal air. And they got nitrogen narcosis down there, and that probably was a factor in the eventual death. Because one of them got pinned in the U-boat when he was trying to excavate a canvas he thought would identify the U-boat. And something fell on him, and his father swam in and got him off. But at that time, they already had spent too much air for the decompression, and when they got back out, they couldn't find the extra tanks. And eventually they shot for the surface, and they both died of decompression sickness. One on the boat and the other after being airlifted with a helicopter in the decompression chamber. But the first clue they recovered from the U-boat is that piece of china. It says 1942 and has a swastika on it, but they cannot find out which U-boat it actually is, so they have different theories. They talk to an old German U-boat ace that's 88 years old, and he tells them he thinks it's his colleague who got different orders, but he thought that it was in his blood that he wanted to go to New York and hunt. And that's why he thought that was a specific U-boat. And another theory was that it was a U-boat that was sunk by civil air patrols that was used during the Second World War, and the Navy sort of hushed that up a little bit because they didn't want the American population to know that civil pilots were needed to hunt for these U-boats. Neither of these theories turn out to be true, and both Chatterton and Kohler, the two main divers, do a lot of research at the archives in Washington DC as well as in Germany, in the archives there, and they discuss these things with lots of U-boat experts, and they figure out that nobody knows anything that'll help them. So they have to find out on their own and do their own research. They also found out that after the war, a lot of the naval assessments would just go from probably not sunk to sunk, because they just wanted to close the cases. So originally the U-boat was thought to have been sunk off of Gibraltar in Africa, which was obviously not the case because it was close to New York off the coast. So after 6 years, they finally retrieve an artifact that'll name the U-boat, which is a U-869, I believe. And that happens when they figure out that they need to go into I think it's an electrical motor room, but it's sort of blocked off. So Chatterton has to remove his tank and then swim through the hole first and then bring his tank in after that. And then the diver would stand outside, and while he was rummaging through the room and found something, he would hand it back to the diver outside, and then he would have to put the tank through the hole and swim through himself again. So it's very dangerous, really. If he got stuck in there, anything happened, nobody could help him. And he, in fact, comes very close to dying, both from getting pinned and also from running out of gas. But he survives, and they get some tags that identify the U-boat. And the history of Hitler's U-boats are very interesting, in fact. And in the beginning of the war in 1939, and maybe a few years forward, the U-boats were a serious threat. They really had no way to find them, and many of the ships were not well protected by convoys with destroyers in them and stuff like that. So the U-boats sank a lot of American ships and British ships at that time. But later on, the Allies applied all of their ingenuity and technology, and they came up with radar and sonar and all kinds of technological advances. And they also broke the Enigma code that the Germans used from U-boat control. So the Allies would know exactly where the U-boats were headed to, and when they spoke to control, they would know where they were going and what their orders were. So the U-boats went from being extremely successful and highly revered to being pretty much sitting ducks in a bucket of water because the Allies would know exactly where they were, and they could follow them with sonar and radar. And the U-boats couldn't stay submerged for that long either. And if you've ever seen the Das Boot, you see how they dive down, and then immediately the destroyers will start launching depth charges to try and blow them up. And there were also planes that would spot the U-boats and drop bombs on them. So out of the 40,000 men that the Germans sent out on U-boats, only 10,000 survived, and in fact 30,000 died. And not all of the U-boats are accounted for. So in the beginning of the war, it was crack forces, it was sort of elite forces. And at the end, they would pretty much put anyone into U-boats and send them out because they never expected them to return anyway. And U-boat 869 was a very young crew. The commandant was 25. His name was Helmut Neuerberg. And his second in command was 22, I think, Siegfried Brandt. And they identified all of these guys from the crew list. And they also found Chatterton and Kohler in Germany, both relatives of the crew of this U-boat. And they also found one guy who was a survivor of the U-boat because he never went on patrol because he got sick right before the U-boat was to leave from Germany. And he recounted all of the training and what happened before and stuff like that. And at that point in time in the war, the U-boat crew knew that they probably would never return. And he recounts one of those moments where they're saying goodbye to the family and having some, a little bit of a party really. And these 3 crew members told the family we're not coming back, and they just started to cry. Because at that point in time, it was pretty widely known that being in a U-boat was probably a death sentence. So I got really interested in these stories about these men that went in these U-boats and sailed for months on end without showers, being 50 guys in extremely shallow space and knowing that they probably would never return. And there's a book called Iron Coffins, was written by a German who was at first a U-boat crewman and later a commandant that actually survived the whole war from 39 to 45. And it's called Iron Coffins, and I'll also be reading that, and if it's good, I'll do a video on that as well. And there's also a dive video of John Chatterton actually diving the U-boats that the book is about with Trimex, and he's providing commentary for the video, and I'll link that in the description. The book is filled with the vivid descriptions of the actual dive, so you feel like you're there yourself, and in the language and the way the book is composed, it's a lot like following a detective novel also. So they spend time in the water and you get some great descriptions of that, and also some knowledge about diving if you don't know much about it. And at the same time you're following this sort of detective story on land where they're trying to research and go to Germany, and they also actually, when they identify the correct U-boat number, they go back to Germany and meet with relatives to tell them what the fate of the U-boat 869 actually was, so they can get some closure. They meet with the commandant's son, who was 2 years old when he set out, and also the brother of the second one in command, Siegfried Brandt. His brother Hans Georg had actually been on the sub to see it before Siegfried set out. I think he was 12 or 13 at the time. And he asked for an artifact from Kola to send over to him, so he would have something from the boat where his brother died. But this is one of those books where I read it, and immediately there's like 5 other books that I really want to read, both about the U-boat war itself and also more about the dive tragedy, the book The Last Dive, about the 2 Rousey, father and son, who died. So if you find all of this interesting, pick up Shadow Divers. And before long, after reading it, you'll be watching Das Boot and trying to figure out what happened in the U-boat war. Maybe even get inspired to scuba dive if you haven't already. Or maybe you'll be inspired to never scuba dive ever in your life. Well, that's the book, guys. Shadow Divers. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you all next time.